Understanding the difference between energy and electricity is going to be the key towards humans developing a low carbon, 100% electrified future. Because as we introduce more and more renewable energies, this understanding could be what makes or breaks our power grids.
Crispy Perspectives.
Welcome, members of the Perspective Club, to another season of Crispy Perspectives on the future of energy. What's interesting is this time we have switched our roles. I'm your host, and Kedar is going to be your expert on energies. Kedar by himself is an amazing connoisseur of energy knowledge across India and the globe, has worked on grids, powers, and electricity domains, has great knowledge and grassroots level experience of energy. So, welcome, Kedar, on this brand new episode of Crispy Perspectives, the future of energies.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's our show, but it feels really weird yet nice to be sitting on the other side of the mic for a change.
It's crazy for me too because the entire season before this, I was the guest and you were the host. So this is going to be interesting. So Kedar, I understand that today we are going to talk about something obvious yet not obvious, but super interesting. And it's as basic as the difference between energy and electricity. Why have we chosen this topic?
Well, quite simply put, Sahil, the future of energy is going to be electricity. And so it makes great sense that for anybody working in the domain, in the industry, right from the youngest career entrant to an experienced campaigner, is that they understand how the grids are changing around us, how the way we talk about energy is changing around us. And so when we talk about the future of energy, we're talking about the future of electricity. And so this seemed to be the best topic to start about, right from the very ABCs of energy and electricity.
Wow, that's amazing. But let's all skip the jargon. Explain this to me like a 7-year-old who does not understand energy or electricity.
We're going to, if I remember that famous show, Kya Panchvi Pass Ho Ya Fail Ho? We're going to try that out with all of our listeners, see if I pass the exam or not. So, the classic difference between what electricity is, the classic understanding of what electricity is, can be explained through this really, really simple analogy that I heard quite a while ago, was from one of my seniors. Think about electricity as compared to water flowing through a hose. So the hose can be compared to this electricity line, and the water flowing inside the hose can be compared to the electricity itself, the electrons that are flowing. So when you see the water flowing in a hose, the water has a certain pressure. The water flows in a different rate on the basis of the size of the hose, and the water also flows in a different rate compared to whether the hose is clean or if there's sand and other obstacles inside. Now, if you look at this from an electricity point of view, the pressure of the water flowing inside the hose can be directly correlated to the voltage of the electricity. While the size of the hose, which determines how much water flows or not, can be correlated to the current of the electrons that are flowing in. And the sand or the other obstacles can be directly correlated to the resistance of that is being provided against electricity. So this is the basic fundamentals of electricity, ABC.
What's interesting is, Kedar, now I will never look at water the same again because I never assumed that electricity could be visualized. I've only seen electric cables and LED lights, bulbs, and maybe some devices that are light up because of electricity. But now that there is a direct correlation between a wire and a water pipe, I think I'll now be able to visualize electricity more clearly. Thanks a lot for that. But let's move beyond wires. Let's talk about a bunch of wires, and by a bunch I don't mean a few hundred or a few thousand. I'm talking about millions of wires, all of them put together, that's what powers our cities and our communities. So how are they managed? I mean, it's a huge network of these wires, and I understand if it was the same for water, it would have been a huge network. So what is this network, and what are these millions of wires coming together? How is it managed?
Great question. And for that, we have to understand another fundamental term of electricity, actually called as power. So, going back to our water pipe analogy, now you have, let's say, water flowing through this pipe. And if you look at a certain point of that pipe, you actually have water flowing through that point over a certain period of time, right? So, the flow rate of that water, how much water is flowing? Is it flowing fastly? Is it flowing slowly? That is directly correlating to what we call power. So power, which is measured in watts, or probably more universally recognized kilowatts, is what basically powers our cities, our cars, our electricity devices, our electrical appliances, and our homes. This power, which is basically flowing through these hundreds and thousands and millions of lines, is what is known as an electrical grid. So when people think about what is the biggest machine that they've ever seen in their lives, they think it's probably a hydroelectric dam, or probably, I don't know, a nuclear reactor. But actually, the biggest machine that has ever been developed in humankind is something that we see all around us, but we never realize it. It's because the electrical grid is a single machine that is operating right from generation all the way to consumption, with one singular purpose of providing electricity reliably, sufficiently, and scalably for all humans. So that is the scale at which we're talking about. That is what forms an electric grid, and that is what governs our lives, because electricity is more and more becoming a fundamental necessity.
What a way to put things simply. But yes, then if we talk about grids, I don't think these are some things which existed only today. These have been there, I think, since generations. So how did it come to be that grids today the way they are? And as you mentioned, they are a singular body, like a single machine working in unison all across consumption, right from the beginning of production. So how did these grids come to be? How did they emerge?
Great question, and I'm by no means a domain expert here. Lots of other people on whose shoulders I'm standing here today. But it's quite fascinating when you do the research on this. It just started all in the Americas, right? Where you realized that you needed electricity to power your devices. And so they started creating these huge power plants, usually run on coal or some other source. And then they thought these plants looked very ugly, and they didn't want it near the places where they lived. So they decided to build it somewhere, and they're living somewhere else. And they realized, oh my God, we have a problem. We're generating, we're living somewhere else. We need to get the electricity over to us. And so that's where they started building these transmission lines, overhead cables, as we call them, and as we see them today. And so these were almost a century ago. So when we're talking about a machine that is 100 years old in certain countries. And this is how they came into being at the start.
But Kedar, are the grids all across the world same? As an American grid same as Indian grid, or am I jumping the gun?
Not at all. Grids across the world are fundamentally same, right? The electricity that you get from a plug outlet or a socket in America is the same electricity that you're going to get from a socket in India. It is just that there are different forms of electricity, and different types of electricity are being generated, and different electricity is being transmitted. And so for this, we go back to our famous water pipe analogy, where electricity comes in two forms and sizes. Let's assume you have water flowing through the grid. If the water flows in one direction, it is correlated to what is called DC electricity, or direct current. And if the water flows, let's say, in alternating directions, to and fro, that can be directly correlated to what we call as alternating current, AC electricity. So grids all over the world today supply AC electricity, but certain energy generation sources generate what is known as DC, or direct current.
Wow, that's interesting. I also have learned AC is preferable for long distance transmission because the losses are lower, and DC is preferable for short distance because the energy transmission is more effective, etc. But one question over here still remains, right? So, are you mentioned that fundamentally the grids are same, but can an American grid, because you said the electricity that flows through the grids is different. How is it different? Can you explain a bit further on the difference between the electricity in country A versus country B?
Great question. And this goes to probably the most fundamental aspect of the power grid itself, or what is called as the grid frequency. Since, as you mentioned earlier, alternating current or AC is much more preferable to distribute over longer or to transmit over longer distances. And the reason is because there are lesser losses. So if you, let's say, send 100 units of alternating current from the generation source, you'll probably receive 90 units at the consumption area. As opposed to if you send 100 units of direct current, you probably receive 60 units, which is then more losses. But the peculiar or particular characteristic about alternating current is that it oscillates. So you've got waves of electricity. This electricity travels in the form of a wave, a sine wave. And so it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. And this is what is called as the frequency of current. So you can play around with this frequency and tune it. Frequency is usually measured in hertz. And early engineers of the grid, what they did was exactly that. They played around with different frequencies and they basically set on a specific frequency, saying that this frequency is what we want to transmit to, because we see that 1, it has the least amount of loss, 2, it probably has the best transmission coverage, and 3, this frequency is what we are going to use to power our lights. So earliest grids were basically used for powering lights and motors. And lights and motors usually basically, if you look at the early tungsten lights, they basically flicker if you look at it very, very closely. And this flickering of the light is very, very directly correlated to the frequency of the current. When the current comes, it turns on. When it goes, it turns off. And this is happening at a very fast rate. And engineers found out that at this specific rate of 50 hertz, which is basically 1 by 50th of a second, right? You have the lights, the flicker is not basically irritating for people. And so they decided, okay, we will settle on 50 hertz. A certain set of engineers decided, okay, 50 hertz is still not good enough. We still see some flickering of the lights. Let's up it a bit to 60 hertz. And which is why you find today that grids run on 2 different sets of frequencies. You have the 50 hertz grid, which is Europe, Asia, Africa, and you have the 60 hertz grids, which are basically North America mainly and a few parts of South America.
I had no clue that flickering of lights is because of this engineer back then in the history thinking about what can be the most comfortable flicker for a human being. But then what about the production of electricity itself? I understand that the electricity is produced and we have discussed at length about how it is brought to you and what forms of electricity is brought to you, how you have consumed it, the AC versus DC, and the transmission angle to it. But we have not touched upon the electricity generation angle. So how would you look at it? Is it better the way it is happening right now, or there are alternates which can be even better for our future?
Another amazing question. And for this, again, you have to probably go back 100 years into history and then travel from there on. So earliest electricity was generated using what we call energy sources. Of course, I know this is also the place where we say, okay, this is electricity and this is energy, right? Where I mentioned earlier, from going back to the water pipe analogy, the flow rate of the water in a hose can be directly correlated to power. The flow rate over time is what we correlate to energy. So if you have, let's say, a bucket at the end of the hose, the bucket is, let's say, 20 liters, and you say that, okay, you allow the water to flow into the bucket. The time it takes to collect the 20 liters over time, or 20 liters into, let's say, how much time it collects this water is what we call energy. So this is the fundamental difference between electric power or electricity and energy. Now going to energy sources, you had traditionally energy being generated from, or electricity being generated from, coal. Coal basically was used to heat up water, and the steam that came up was used to run these large motors. Fun fact, these motors were also running at a speed correlated to 50 hertz, because frequency and speed of motors are directly correlated. And using this huge turbines or huge motors, you then generated the electricity, which was then transferred. But as we moved on, you had oil, you had natural gas. So this is now us traveling. And now over the last 20 years, we've seen that, hey, these things are quite polluting. And now we want to shift to different types of sources that are less polluting. And so now we're completely trying to switch to a newer form of energy that is generated from, let's say, solar energy or the wind, or of course, expanding hydroelectric energy, looking at even more radical forms of energy like geothermal, and of course trying to a bit undecided on the future of nuclear energy, which has been a very, very strong supplier of power for us. So this is that entire 100-year roller coaster ride of energy generation that we are going through, and we're at the next transition at the moment.
So this transition is what is the most interesting part. I think our crispy perspective on the future is going to be typically focused on the transition of not just national but also an international grid system as a whole. So I understand majority are still conventional, right? Majority of countries are still producing electricity conventionally, and there is going to be a transition phase. I think we are in the middle of it. While the transition starts from some countries having a lot of solar, lot of wind, and lot of hydro or nuclear, while some countries begin from zero. So let's talk about the transition. What happens when such variables are introduced on a transmission and consumption side of the grid? So the transition from the conventional to renewable sort of a production, and then talking about the transition on the consumption side as well. So is there anything that is a correlation? And if this transition is happening, what do you think? Is it happening efficiently right now?
Sahil, I think for that we have to step back, take a step back and see what makes new age energy sources like solar and wind different from the conventional energy sources like coal and natural gas. So coal was something that, for example, that was available aplenty. Sarcastically speaking, we're now running out of that as well. But these coal power plants usually run on a 24-hour cycle. They're constantly turning these motors in order to produce electricity. When you needed more energy, you basically spin up another turbine, add in more coal, and when you needed less energy, you stop a turbine. So you had this constant reliable supply of coal and basically ergo electricity that you could then throttle up and down over a 24-hour cycle. But when it comes to new age energy resources, we know that the sun doesn't shine for 24 hours a day, nor does the wind blow for 24 hours a day, which means that you're going to have periods where you're generating and periods where there's going to be no generation, so zero. So that is the fundamental difference between old age and, let's call it, old age and new age sources. And now what happens when you introduce this, right? Before we go there also on the demand side. So you and me as consumers of electricity, we don't, honestly speaking, care that there is lesser or higher production of energy. We want, when we connect our laptops or our mobile phones to a socket, we expect electricity to be there, right? If not, I've seen countries and I've seen cities revolt or strike against not having electricity or reliable electricity. So we want our electricity, be it day or night. And what happens is that when you're moving from a source where you say, okay, 24 hours, we can either throttle up and down, to a source which says, oh, 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day only I can provide, and rest of it, no electricity, you are going to have people raising serious questions, right? What happens for those 18 odd hours a day when there's no sunlight? Or what happens for those 10 to 12 odd hours a day when there's no wind? When you introduce this amount of renewable energies like solar or wind, you are going to have questions on whether we are going to have reliable electricity or not in the future. And at the same time, you are also now pushing for more electrical devices in the household. You're going to ask for electric vehicles, you're going to ask for heat pumps, which were earlier, for example, mechanical devices. And so you're going to have a higher demand, whereas a non-reliable or a relatively non-reliable supply. So you are definitely going to have an imbalance in the grid. And the grid traditionally was not designed to handle imbalances. It was always designed to constantly supply electricity from one side to another. The second part, when you add variable energy resources, is that when there is a surplus of energy production, from the solar energy plant or the wind plant, you can use whatever you have to use. But then when you have surplus electricity, you don't know what to do with it. You traditionally have to either throw away the electricity, which means turn off the power plant, or what people are doing nowadays is try to store it in some place like a battery so that you can use it later on. The grid also was not developed to handle feeding in of energy from the consumption side. It was only supposed to feed in from the generation side, be transmitted, be distributed, and be consumed. But now this introduction of variable energy resources, solar and wind, is completely challenging our way of thinking. So it's equally exciting and frightening.
Wow, you're living in a crazy world. And if I was told by my government that yes, you will get a clean energy coming to your house, but it will only be available during the day, I'll be scared. Honestly, I'll be super scared. But yes, that I understand that's important, and that brings us to a bigger question, right? So electrification as a whole, we have talked about consumption, grids, the production, the types of electricity, and everything around that. But let's talk about the users now. Why is electrification so important? Or I still know that in tier two and tier three cities, there are still communities which can thrive without electricity, like farming and agriculture communities, as well as those which live on remote areas in the world which don't have access to 100% electricity yet, but they're still living and thriving. So my bigger question is now, why is this electrification important? Is it important for us as a species, as human beings, to survive for the future?
Well, there's probably two to three different parts to this answer. There is the most obvious part, which was that earlier when you had devices powered by, let's say, conventional sources, let's say you have a diesel motor, a motor powered by diesel or petrol, you're going to have a lot of emissions from that. Whereas you have an electric motor, you're going to have virtually no emissions. So the first big angle for moving towards electrification, quite simply put, is this emissions angle and the sustainability angle. That you want to pollute less, you want to leave a cleaner earth for future generations. The second angle is from an efficiency standpoint of view. An electric device is a people who've driven, let's say, for example, a conventional car with lots of moving parts versus an electric car with relatively lesser moving parts, and see that electric vehicle is a lot more efficient. The same goes for all electrical appliances. So the second standpoint of view is this efficiency standpoint. And the third standpoint is that we virtually want to drive down prices of electricity, which means that electricity has to become more and more affordable, as opposed to fossil fuel, which will as we go, due to basically scarcity, only become more and more expensive. And so we want to make electricity as fundamentally easy and affordable for everyone as possible. And so the only way to do that is to start electrifying all your in-use consumption devices. So I think these 3 points beautifully convey the reason as to why we nations and humans as a whole are pushing towards electrifying their consumption.
What's beautifully put is you have highlighted some very key points, and you have not created a sense of urgency behind them, and that really brings me to sort of a question where can you actually show this urgency, or can you actually show a correlation within electrification and the end user? Is there a way to do it? Is there a right way to do it?
Absolutely. And this is a great question that you've asked, because there happens to be a visual representation which also shows the difference between energy and electricity.
What's it called?
It's called an energy chart. So you have the energy charts which are developed, for example, by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in the US. These depict, they put it out annually, by the way, and they, in a single chart, depict the entire physical energy flows which have been captured in the US for that year, right? So you've got charts almost 20 years ago to charts as recent as 2022, 2023. So in it, you can basically see how the energy from generation is moving all the way towards consumption. And more importantly, what are the losses that are taking place in between? What are the losses that are taking place in the direct transmission? What are the losses that are taking place as it gets converted to electricity? And this chart basically gives a beautiful visual explanation as to what is the difference also between energy and electricity. Classic example, you will see that in households across, let's say, the world, there are two forms of cooking. One is where you have a gas-fired stove. You can basically connect a cylinder to it, and then you have gas in that, so an LPG cylinder. And the other is basically you have induction stoves which are powered by electricity. Now, assume that you have a natural gas producing plant. Now, this gas production plant can basically send this gas through pipelines to the home, and then you can basically have these pipelines feed into your stove and use it for cooking. So you got direct gas cooking, or you use the natural gas, convert it to electricity, and then feed it via electrical lines to the home. You will see that in America, and you can see this in the diagram, that's why it's so beautiful. There is somewhere around a 35% loss when you convert energy into electricity. which means you're only getting 65% of the value of that natural gas when you convert it to electricity. This means on one end that it's probably is not the most efficient form of cooking at the moment, but it is getting more and more efficient as you basically make advances over the years, technological advances. So that is one visual representation that I would urge every energy enthusiast to go and look at, purely to understand the difference between and the scale at which what we're talking about this energy transition here.
That's crazy. I right after the podcast ends, I'm going to head out and look at it. But yes, moving ahead, and thanks for this explanation. This very well puts together how a flow from a particular energy source would go to a particular user's consumption. But moving on, and I think we are coming towards the last few segments. Let's talk about different ways in which we can actually tackle this electrification. Because if we are now talking about everyone, each human being on the planet getting electricity for the 24-hour cycle without any breaks in between, and also high quality electricity available through cleaner sources or probably renewable sources 100%, which of course gives sustenance to a resident while also giving sustenance to cities, industries, and so on. How can we actually tackle this kind of a demand? Because if the demand rises, the supply has to rise in equivalence or more. So how do you think we can do that? Because we should stop the dependence on coal, right? If we are going to cut coal and then we are going to move to renewables, how can we do this? And what are the ways in tackling this kind of increased demand?
The most logical question to ask as to when you're increasing electrification and when you're increasing demand, what happens to supply? Going back to our famous, I love this water pipe analogy. So the bucket at the end of the hose where the water is flowing in denotes demand. The water denotes electricity and the pipe basically denotes an electrical line. Now, the water is flowing there at a certain rate. Demand you basically means that you want to increase the size of the bucket. But you cannot expect the electricity to flow at a different rate just because you increase the size of the bucket. Yeah, electricity is going to flow at the same rate. You say, chalo, okay, now I want more electricity, so I will increase the pressure of the pipe, which means that at some point the hose is going to burst, which is basically what we're doing at the moment. We're trying to feed in so much electricity that we risk the catastrophe of burning out our grids, and that is what is happening. You're seeing at certain places grids are transmission lines are being burned off, and so lots of places renovations, which then leads to brownouts or blackouts, rolling blackouts across countries. One way to tackle this is just basically by bringing in two hoses as opposed to one hose. If you have a bigger bucket, just bring in two hoses. So that's what's happening. We're trying to expand the grid, but this is really slow, a slow process, because you need to first get the land to build those transmission lines on. People are not usually happy when you do that. So then you need to bring in the equipment, which is then a supply chain problem. And then you need to have the expertise needed to install this and then connecting it to the existing grid and so on. So this is one option. The second option is that, okay, you ask the guy who's picking the bucket, can you for now bring a smaller bucket because we're not having that much water. And then once we do have more water, get a second bucket. So you basically ask the demand, the person who's needing the water, the electricity, to be flexible. This is called demand side flexibility as another way to tackle increasing electrification. And that's what countries are doing actually, by asking people to be flexible with their electricity usage. For example, we usually have a tendency to turn on our TVs and washing machines and dishwashers once we get back from office, which is because that makes sense, right? Because that's when we're back home. But this is also the time when we don't have electricity plenty, especially because there's no sunlight and wind is also low. And so we say that, hey, instead of using your washing machine at night, why don't you try to use them during the day? That way you can have a surplus electricity and you can have relatively green electricity, as they call it, or low carbon electricity. So this asking the consumer to be flexible with his demand and then incentivizing him is one way to then tackle this. Another way, which might sound a bit critical, is that we try not to have this variable generation resources on the grid itself, because when they usually feed in more electricity or less electricity due to this variable supply nature, other resources are also being hurt, because other resources which are basically able to maintain a constant supply are then forced to throttle down at unnatural times. thus leading to this imbalance in the grids. So then we try to, let's say, for example, as an option, say that let's keep solar or restrict solar to the rooftops and not bring them onto the utility level. And so those people who want to use solar can use it on their rooftops. They can supply it directly to their homes. Another option that is being thought about is chopping up our big grid into smaller parts. You have dedicated solar energy resources for smaller grids, and so if one part of the grid goes off, the other parts of the grids don't have to worry about blackouts. And this is another option called microgrids, which are also being explored and experimented on in different countries. And then finally, you also have these intermediate storage devices as they to tackle this huge surplus of electricity that is being fed in by renewables. You have batteries. You're also talking about exploring options like green hydrogen, or hydrogen as it's called. Hydrogen basically being this intermediate storage device. And so the good news is that we have lots of options. We are exploring lots of new things, and it's just a matter of time until every country clicks on that perfect combination of how they want to tackle this electrification wave.
I mean, Kedar, this is amazing. I think to summarize whatever we have spoken since the beginning of the episode, we started with talking about what is electricity and the difference between electricity and energy. And to explain it to someone who is not from this domain or is like a 7-year-old who does not understand any of this, you gave the water pipe analogy, which was the simplest of it all. Then we moved to the grids, that is to transmit the types of electricity, the generation of it. Then we came all the way till the users. Then we talked about the importance of electrification and the ways in which we can tackle the electrification. So I think this is one of those episodes which somebody who doesn't understand electricity and energy should listen to clear their fundamentals. And for someone who already understands all of this and is from the domain, should listen to, so that they can basically have a revision of their fundamentals. But moving on, let us say all of what we spoke about is achieved. We have won whatever we have won. And there is a future where 100% electrification has taken place. So walk us through an average day.
that is probably going to be one of the most difficult questions I've had to answer as to how a future would look like when you have 100% electricity. But keeping in mind that we want to make electricity as affordable as possible and as basic a right as possible for everybody. Let's take a person, a random person, Ram. He lives in a home. Let's say let's go about his day, right? He wakes up in his smart home, which is then governed or which is then operated by this advanced energy management system. He wakes up, his energy management system knows this timing of when he wakes up, and then automatically starts operating stuff in his home. It throttles up the thermostat so that the room becomes warmer for him to wake up. It starts turning on electrical appliances like the water heater and his stove so that they are preheated for him to cook. And all of this, during this time, Ram is not worried. He goes into his bathroom. He takes a shower, a warm shower with water that has been heated or preheated by a water heater, which is then completely running on electricity that is fed from the household battery overnight. He then goes into his kitchen, starts preparing for his breakfast and for his work day. Or his energy management system realizes that he needs a little more energy, so it basically pulls in more electricity from a community battery, which is then powering their entire community with electricity. He then finishes breakfast and then heads out to his electric vehicle and heads over to work. All the while he's driving to work, he's not worried about his electric vehicle's battery because it is being charged using electricity wirelessly from the road on which the car is driving. Once he heads to his office, he just connects his vehicle to the grid via an electric charger so that the battery can be used for, among other things, to power the grid when there is a higher demand. So it's vehicle to grid based charging. So this grid interaction is very, very smooth, happens in a couple of milliseconds. All he has to do is plug in. He heads into his office, which is then a net zero space powered entirely by electricity in an entire commercial district. Building is run on energy management systems. Again, it realizes, hey, Ram's building has more occupancy today, whereas another office building has lesser occupancy. So let us divert electricity, or let us transfer the stored electricity from this building into another building. So that's peer-to-peer sharing of electricity between buildings, all done autonomously. He then heads out for lunch. Let's say he works, heads out for lunch to a cafe. Cafe is run entirely using zero emission electricity systems. It has a zero emission kitchen, zero emission HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And he eats his food, comes back, works for a couple of hours, and then decides to call it a day. Decides that on his way back home, he wants to go to a park. So he goes to a park and plugs in his car for charging. And then while he's walking, he realizes that the street lights in the park are being powered or by his footsteps. So that's piezoelectric form of electricity generation. Once he goes back home, he finishes with his park, he goes back home. He realizes that everyone is coming back home. So the energy management system for the community itself decides to draw excess power from an SMR.
SMR is short for Small Modular Reactor. It is a miniaturized version of a conventional nuclear reactor. A classic example is the use of SMR in submarines. There are three key differentiators between SMRs and the conventional nuclear reactor. One, the power generation is in gigawatts for a larger conventional reactor, while in SMR it is limited at a max of around 300 megawatts. Second, these reactors are extremely modular. Just like batteries, you can add them on and create more capacity. And third, these reactors are easy to assemble and move around. For example, an SMR can be assembled in weeks as compared to years that are needed for a conventional reactor.
That is being used to power their microgrid. The reactor then generates electricity. Electricity is pumped into the homes. The energy management systems then take this electricity, start turning on the entertainment systems, start getting the kitchen ready for dinner for different people to cook, and Ram then cooks dinner and relaxes before going off to bed, where then the thermostat is then automatically turned on again. His home is heated by the time, and so he goes off to bed. So this is how I think a day is going to look like in a fully electrified future.
So Kedar, what I really like about the way you spoke is you spoke about crazy technologies in so much ease as if it's existent today. But there is one technology which I want to question you on is for the entire episode you kept talking about the water hose, the pipe, the wire, and suddenly you started talking about wireless charging. So you're telling me that the water hose starts disappearing in the future and electricity travels to the devices wirelessly. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, why not? We already have today phones that can charge wirelessly. So this is electricity that is being transmitted between two pads through the form of induction-based charging. So what is stopping us from extrapolating this technology on to different types of electrical appliances like cars? So, and I think with the amount of talent that we have, the amount of research that's going on, we would see this happening, turning into reality. This is very, very important for electricity becoming affordable and a birthright for every citizen of the world, that it is available in plenty and it is affordable, and that it is very, very easy to access to every end user. So this is one of those technologies that is going to go towards making all of this happen.
So, if in the future I am not supposed to carry any cables, I'm just supposed to carry my devices around, I am super excited for the future. Yes, yes. Thanks a lot, Kedar. This was a wonderful episode. I definitely learned a lot. I could brush up on all of my fundamentals. And the most important thing is, I could actually visualize a lot of what I just read in theory. And for all our listeners, thank you very much for joining in. Be sure to share this episode with all of your friends, like minded energy enthusiasts, and everyone in your circles. Don't forget to join the Perspective Club. Like, subscribe, and do share this ahead. We will see you soon in another episode of Crispy Perspectives.